Good morning. I am Dariusz Stola. I'm the director of the POLIN Museum. And I have the pleasure of chairing this morning session. Thank you all of you who came on this chilly morning. Yes, and I welcome Natalia in particular. The title of this session is Realities. And as you will see, we will in particular deal with what I believe to be the foundation of history, at least of human history, which is demography. And both the real demography and the perceived demography. We'll have two papers, one on the actual Jewish population of the new Polish state in the early 1920s, and the perceived Jewish population in another paper. We have three distinguished speakers and an equally distinguished commentator. The first paper, The Jewish Population on the Polish Lands on the Eve of Poland's Independence, by Konrad Zieliński. Konrad is the professor and the head of the Faculty of Studies on Ethnicity at the Maria Curie-Skłodowska University in Lublin. He specializes in the history of Jews in Poland and Russia, Soviet Union national policy, migration processes, and interethnic and interreligious relations. His scholarly production includes some 150 publications, including several monographs, and among them Stosunki polsko-żydowskie na ziemiach Królestwa Polskiego w czasie I wojny światowej, exactly on a topic of our interest, on Polish relations during the First World War, o Polską Republikę Rad, działalność polskich komunistów w Rosji Radzieckiej, and the Lost World Polish Jews photographs from 1918-1939. Currently, his research focuses on anti-Jewish pogroms in Galicia in the first years of Poland's independence. And as I said, his paper will focus on demography, on the Jewish population, its size, structure, geographic distribution, and so on. I have a special respect for demography, which is the only social science with predictive capacity for more than 20 years. And it's at the bottom of all history, certainly economic history, political history, but also cultural and intellectual history. There is always some population at the bottom of it. So we will start with this basic presentation, and then we will have a paper by Robert Blobaum on the Specter of Judeo-Polonia and the Politics of Containment 1918 and beyond, and this is exactly the perceived demography of Polish Jewry. And finally, the paper by Eugenia Prokop-Janiec, 1918, Institutions of Jewish Culture on the Eve of Poland's Independence, so on the cultural infrastructure of this Jewish population in the new Polish state. Each of the speakers will have some 20 to 25 minutes for the presentation. Then we will have a commentary by Jochen Böhler. And finally, I hope a lot of time for your questions and discussions. So the floor is to Konrad Zieliński.
Thank you very much. I start with trivial statement. The Jewish population in Poland was not a homogeneous community. The differences in mentality, customs, tradition, and economic situation or political sympathies between the Jewish inhabitants of particular regions were greater than in the Polish society of the three partitions. One can even speak, I have in mind Ezra Mendelssohn, of 3 or even 4 Jewish communities on Polish territory in the former Kingdom of Poland, in the lands which during the partitions were directly incorporated into the Russian Empire, Galicia, and a small community of the former Prussian partition. This diversity, especially in political reality, caused that it was more difficult to decide on a common position and to defend Jewish rights in a situation where the rights were violated or threatened. However, I would rather focus on the demographic situation and economic condition of of the Jewish population. The moment Poland regained its independence, it inherited 6 different legal systems, 6 currencies, 3 administrative and school systems, 4 designs of uniforms, 2 widths of railway tracks, 3 different braking systems. What is more, until 1925, there was left-side traffic in Galicia. However, it was not a serious problem. Anyway, the aforementioned differences well illustrate the enormity of the tasks faced by the emerging state. What is more, Poland had to merge so many different administrative organisms into one during a struggle for borders and territory. As a result of the war, the population of Polish lands from January 1914 to January 1919 fell by more than 4 million, about 13%, including the evacuation of the population from the areas affected by the war. In 1927, despite the significant post-war population growth and repatriation, it was when Poland reached the population level from the year 1914. Central and eastern voivodeships suffered the greatest war losses, while the western voivodeships had a relatively small population loss. The most densely populated were the former Galicia. It was about exactly 95 persons per square kilometers, western 84, and central voivodeships 79, out of which the eastern voivodeships clearly differed in this respect, with the population of 31 persons per square kilometer, while the national average constituted 68 persons per square kilometers. The results of the first population show 25,691,000 people, even after the addition of Silesian and Vilnius lands, which at the time of the census were not yet de jure part of Poland. There were about 27 million people. The first years of independence were characterized by a very strong population growth. In the years 1919-1923, an average of 1.9% per year, which was due to a high post-war birth rate and an emigration of about 1,265,000 people until 1924. The population growth was over 400,000 higher than the immigration of Germans and most of the Jews living in the Poznań region, Pomerania, and Silesia. The formerly mentioned high birth rate, a very typical phenomenon after each war, was high in each religious and national group, although relatively low in the case of the Jewish population. According to the Central Statistical Office data on live births by religion in 1926-1930, no such data for earlier years, the birth rate in this group was 19.6 promille, while for the Roman Catholic population it made 32.6, while for the Orthodox and Greek Catholics it was even higher. In the case of mortality rate, the situation was similar. Among Jews it was 9.9 promille and was much lower than in the case of other religious and national groups. In the years 1926-1930, 64 infant deaths per 100 births were recorded among Jews, and 149 in the case of the Catholic population. Natural growth in both groups was 9.7 and 15.9 promille. The Jews were the most urbanized group of the population in interwar Poland. Easier access to doctors, felchers, and healthcare facilities compensated for the temporary losses associated with epidemic diseases in cities. As a result of the high density and increased migration and mobility resulting from the nature of Jewish professional occupation, the urban poor Jewish districts were more prone to become victims of typhus and other infectious diseases. The largest typhus epidemic in the Polish lands began in autumn 1914 in the territory of the Kingdom of Poland and lasted until 1918, when about 90,000 people fell ill. And according to the German and Austrian statistics from 1918, the majority of victims in the occupied kingdom, more than 70-75%, were Jewish. I will second, there were no post-war data on the religion of the sick people. This percentage was probably similar. After the war, the structure of gender in the Polish population was strongly unbalanced. In 1921, the number of women exceeded the number of men by nearly 10%, which was caused mainly by war losses. It's estimated that 385,000 soldiers died in the ranks of the different armies during the war, and nearly 50,000 soldiers died in the battles with the Red Army during the Polish Bolshevik War. And this situation could be similar in the case of the Jewish population, despite the fact that during the Polish Bolshevik War, the number of Jews recruited and killed in combat was smaller due to different reasons, as we know. These, however, were affected to a greater extent by irreversible migrations and epidemics, although the war interrupted foreign immigration, especially overseas immigration, and caused significant internal displacement of the Jewish population, some of which didn't return to their places of residence until the statistics were compiled. Anyway, in 1921, in the structure of the Polish population, by age and gender had clear traces of war losses. They can be noticed in the 1/3 lower percentage of children under 5, which was caused by the fall in birth rate during the war, as well as increased mortality in the years 1915-1921. Generally, Jews lived all over the country, but the highest proportion of the Jewish population was in 11 urban powiats and ranged in central Poland from 19 to 43%. The lowest number of the Jewish population was a characteristic of powiats in western provinces, where it practically didn't exceed 1% of the total population. Stagnation of many workplaces, the collapse of local trade, unemployment, pauperization, restriction on trade, and state monopoly on the sales of many food and industrial goods caused the collapse of small trade and crafts, which were the main source of income for many Jews. As a result, some moved to big cities in search of work. Others emigrated, for example, mainly as a result of war migration, but also widening the administrative borders of many municipalities. The share of the Jewish population in Warsaw dropped from 39.2% of the total population in 1910 to about 33% in 1921, in Poznań from 3.6 to 1.2, while in Krakow it increased from 21 to 25, and in Lviv from 28 to 35%. In 1921, Poland was inhabited by 2,761,000 Jews, including about 2 million in cities and about 700,000 in rural areas. Almost 60% of Jews lived in 5 central voivodeships, while 13.7% of the total population lived in the group of eastern voivodeships, 26.8% in southern voivodeships, and 0.7% in western voivodeships. The concentration of that population in cities was even more noticeable. About 1/3 of the total Jewish population, exactly 917,000 people, lived in 20 cities of the country. The most numerous Jewish population had Warsaw, Łódź, and Lviv. Bereźne and Lublin in Volhynia had the highest proportion of the Jewish population, was about 95%, while on the other hand, in 12 cities of the Poznań voivodeship and 1 Pomeranian voivodeship, there was not a single Jewish person. In total, the highest share of the Jewish population in towns and cities was observed in eastern voivodeships, whereas it was much lower in central and southern. Few Jews lived in villages and rural urban settlements on various sizes. Hence, about 700,000 Jews inhabited the lands which stated for 25% of the total population of this religion. They constituted only 3.7% of the more than 19 million inhabitants of rural areas. Central provinces, mainly Lubelskie and Kieleckie, and southern provinces, mainly mainly. Lviv had the most numerous Jewish population, from 4,3 to about 7%. In eastern voivodeships, Jews constituted 3,8% of rural population, and similarly in southern voivodeships. Numerous urban settlements in the former Russian partition lost by municipal rights in 1870, but still, like the towns of former Galicia, they served as local trade and craft centers, supplying the village with products necessary for agriculture and basic industrial goods. If the population of urban settlements were to be included in the urban population, the share of the Jewish population in the village would fall from 3,7 to 1,8%, and these typical states, inhabited to a large extent by Jews, had the most often population of 1 to 3,000 inhabitants. If we are talking about the occupational structure, any information on the size of employment in industry and various branches of manufacturing comes from a 1921 census and the survey conducted by in the same year by the American Joint Distribution Committee. They show that the highest percentage of the working Jewish population was in the clothing, haberdashery industry, food industry, textile industry, wood industry, and metal industry. The low percentage of the Jewish proletariat of large industries worth mentioning. A non-Jewish worker was usually an industrial worker, while a Jewish worker was employed in small-scale craftsmanship. Jews were not employed or rarely employed in metallurgy, mining, engineering, just like in administration, especially in the state administration. Jewish companies usually gave way to Christian companies. Jewish companies were dominated by one-man and family businesses, possibly employing 2-3 workers, while the largest ones employing more than 51 workers were the most numerous among non-Jewish businesses. The reasons for the relatively low percentage of Jewish workers in large industry were complex. Shortly, it seems that the problem was primarily related to the economic structure of the country and the professional traditions of the Jewish population, as well as the policy of the authorities. Traditionally, the share of Jews in freelance professions was high in the former Kingdom of Poland. The total number of Jews employed in public service and freelance professions was about 15%, mainly medical and legal professions, and in insurance together with trade, more than 66%. Summarizing the professional structure and economic situation of Jews in Poland between the wars, let me recall the words of Ezra Mendelssohn. I quote, "The economic condition of the Polish Jewry was determined by the presence of a significant number of small merchants, shopkeepers, craftsmen, and luftmensch. There was also a narrow but important group of wealthy entrepreneurs, industrialists, professionals, and intellectuals. It cannot be denied that the Jews played a serious role in economic and cultural life. However, the poverty of the Jewish masses was proverbial and indeed, the small-town Jewish communities belong to the poorest social strata. The war left the Polish lands extremely destroyed. The equipment of hundreds of factories and workshops, raw materials, wood, forests, and other resources were damaged or taken away. The forced exploitation of the Kingdom of Poland and the eastern lands during the occupation of the central states, looting, robbery, inflation caused the economy of the reborn state to be in a terrible condition. In agriculture, in addition to direct damage, there was a decline in the level of crops and a reduction in productivity. No losses in building affected villages mostly, where there were not many Jews. However, while large towns and cities suffered relatively little, small towns of the Russian-occupied Galicia and the Lublin, Radom, and Kielce regions of the Kingdom of Poland were sometimes completely destroyed as a result of, among others, course, earth tactics used by the Russian army. The small towns were most often were inhabited by the Jews. It should also be noted that the Jews often unsuccessfully struck for a proper estimation of losses incurred as a result of warfare and post-war pogroms. There is a lot of information about about undervaluing the amount of possible compensation by evaluation and aid commissions dominated by representatives of non-Jewish population. The economic condition of the Jewish population was also greatly affected by trade restrictions. The new state, which before 1914 was a part of three different partitions, lost in natural markets with the change of borders. What is more, in 1919 the state legislated a Sunday arrest law. Though the law was never rigorously enforced, it could be costly in terms of bribes. No, moreover, due to political situation, the fear of espionage in the time of struggle for borders and independence, the authorities prohibited the door-to-door sales. In the first years of independence, the Polish parliament adopted a number of social laws, including 8-hour working days, compulsory insurance for employment, employed workers, etc. But in fact, often because of objective reasons, these laws were not always respected, but due to the nature of employment, the low percentage of industrial workers, difficulties in obtaining a job in public administration and civil services, they didn't apply to the Jews to a large extent. We should also mention the repatriation from Russia, the economic crisis in which the young state found itself shortly after the war, to a great extent determined the attitude of the authorities towards the generally poor, often requiring medical care immigrants. The complicated procedure, including the assessment of property and ability of repatriate or refugee to earn a living in Poland, depended on the attitude of the border and local authorities, and turned out to be a convenient means of regulating the migration movement. And in the post-war Poland, this measure was most often applied to the non-Polish population, often Ukrainians, but most often the Jews. The Jews had also similar problems with obtaining Polish citizenship. The war was connected with a number of unfavorable social phenomena, some of which affected the Jewish population particularly hard. They are statistically more difficult to grasp, but there is no doubt that the Jewish merchants, tradesmen, brokers, who generally had some cash at their disposal, were more exposed to common robbery and banditry. Indeed, newspapers were full of information about robbery of the Jewish merchants. The phenomenon of prostitution, in which, according to fragmentary data from the years of the First World War and the post-war period, the proportion of Jews, both among the women engaged in this practice and its organizers, was exceptionally high in the whole country. Jews sentenced for prostitution constituted more than 25%, while the percentage among those sentenced for the most serious crimes, including murder and banditry, was minimal and didn't exceed 2-3%. Also, comparing data from before the war and from 1918, the birth rate of illegitimate children increased by about 20-25% in villages and about 40% in cities. The war changed the traditional social roles, which on the one hand had positive effects, such as a partial emancipation of women, but on the other hand negative, leading to the breakdown of marriages, an increase in the number of single mothers, abandoned children, and orphans. It should be remembered, however, the war and the accompanying events partially changed and widened the culture and mental framework of the Jewish life. This was often related to the generation conflict between young people and their Orthodox parents, who were attached to traditions, so determinants of the Jewish identity exclusively in religion. The results were, among others, the development of political, national and socialist parties and secular culture. A separate issue is the legal status of Jews living on the Polish lands and the threshold of independence. The legal status situation was complicated due to diverse and often contradictory legislation of the partitioning powers. So one of the most important tasks faced by the Polish legislator was to regulate the legal status of citizens belonging to minorities. I will only mention that from the point of view of the Jewish minority as a whole, the most important act ending legal chaos and unifying their status was the act of 13 March of 1931 on the expiry of the legal force of exceptional provisions related to the origin, nationality, race, language, and nationality of the citizens of the Republic of Poland. However, nearly 10 years, the territory of the new state was governed by the laws of the partitioning states, which discriminated against minorities. For example, in the former Russian partition, Jews were denied to access to some public functions, and the law ordered higher penalties for crimes committed by Jews than for those committed by Christians. We should also mention the so-called minority treaty. However, there is no time for that. I would only add that when discussing the situation of the Jewish minority on the eve of independence, it ought to be highlighted that it was not devoid of elite. I have in mind intelligentsia, unlike the Slavic minorities, but also the Polish peasant population in many regions of the country. The percentage of Jewish intelligentsia was quite significant, and I think that this possession of the elite intelligentsia certainly someone softened the start of the Jewish population into independence. I have in mind not only, of course, assimilators, but the new national intelligentsia, people connected with Aguda or radical left. So, summing up, the Jewish population on the eve of the Polish independence shared all the difficulties and pains associated with the reconstruction of the destroyed country. However, some phenomena affected the Jews in a special way, and were to a large extent related to the high degree of urbanization and professional structure of this population, the loss of existing markets and trade restrictions, the difficulties of returning repatriates and refugees from Russia, the underestimation of war losses, banditry affected the Jews to a great extent. However, the unclear legal status, the heritage of partitions, the wave of pogroms that swept through the Polish lands in the years 1918-1921, anti-Semitism, the stereotype of the Jewish communist caused that physical safety and guarantees of equal rights were the most important at the moment for the Jewish communities in Poland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me add that on our website, the Virtual Shtetl, my colleagues have recently compiled data on the most Jewish localities in Poland. And you have seen that the most Jewish of the towns listed in the table was 95%, but there were some 15 localities where the Jews made more than 95%, and in at least 2 they made 100%. And one of them was properly called Kolonia Syjońska. That was in eastern Poland. Now, let me introduce Robert Blobaum, who is the Eberly Family Distinguished Professor of History at West Virginia University, who has written broadly on the social, political, and cultural history of Poland in the first decades of the 20th century. He's best known to this public by the book he edited on anti-Semitism and its opponents in modern Poland, but he is also author of Rewolucja, Russian Poland 1904-1907, and the biography of Felix Dzierżyński. His most recent book is A Minor Apocalypse, Warsaw during the First World War, and his current project is on Polish Jewish small town in the Warsaw region during the first half of the 20th century. And Robert will speak on the Specter of Judeo-Polonia and the Politics of Containment, 1980 and beyond. That is the threatening image of the Jewish masses filling Poland, and especially the capital of Poland. And let me add a little footnote about the most recent study done for CNN about anti-Semitism in Europe, which shows that a non-negligible part of the population, especially of Poland, Hungary, and Great Britain, believe that 20% of the global population is Jewish. So the story that Robert is going to introduce has not completely ended. The floor is yours.
Dziękuję bardzo I dzień dobry. At the beginning of the 20th century, exaggerated notions of illegitimate Jewish wealth, excessive influence, overpopulation, and disproportionate political clout were rife in Central and Eastern Europe. In partitioned Poland, and particularly the so-called Polish kingdom under Imperial Russian domination, rapid socioeconomic change combined with the emergence of mass parties to foster the creation of a modern arena of identity politics based on class and ethnicity. In that arena, the present and future role of Jews became central to public discourse. Jewish linguistic and cultural, if not religious assimilation, the failed solution offered by 19th century liberals in the formula of Poles of the Mosaic faith, gradually gave way, particularly following the 1905 revolution, to schemes of ethnic exclusion. Jewish resistance to both assimilation, originally passive in the absence of autonomous Polish educational institutions under Russian rule, and to exclusion, increasingly active in the pre-war decade of radicalizing mass politics, set off many alarms among Polish nationalists of various stripes. And thus was born the imagined nightmare of Judeo-Polonia, a demonic phantom requiring an exorcism which could only be performed by the real Poles of the nationalist right through the containment, restriction, and better yet, reduction of the Jewish presence on Polish soil. The Polish-Jewish metropolis of Warsaw, the once and future Polish capital, became the primary battleground for waging the struggle against Judeo-Polonia was hardly accidental, host as it was to a plethora of Polish and Jewish political parties, but also the stronghold of the National Democrats. After 1905 and the Tsarist regime's relaxation of censorship, Warsaw also became the epicenter of a mass circulation press, which by 1914 had already made it the country's publishing capital. Following the revolution of 1905 and the rise of so-called Jewish separatists who demanded equal rights in opposition to the interests of the Polish nation, the victory of the feared Judeo-Polonia on the banks of the Vistula seemed to have been confirmed when Jewish voters joined the Polish left in defeating the candidate of the Polish center-right, Jan Kuchaszewski, for Warsaw's single contested seat in the Russian State Duma elections of 1912. This political disaster, as interpreted by Polish nationalists, gave rise to two developments: the initiation of attempts to contain and then reduce the Jewish presence in Warsaw, and especially in its economy, on the one hand, and the emergence of the so-called doctrine of the Polish majority on the other. This doctrine, as defined by Paul Brzezinski, proclaimed that Warsaw, indeed Poland, should be represented by an ethnic Polish majority of franchise voters who tended to cast their ballots for the National Democrats. An Endecja-led boycott of Jewish commerce was conceived in part to punish Jews for violating that doctrine, in part to drive Jews from certain trades to the benefit of their Christian counterparts. During the First World War, dramatic demographic shifts, though peculiar to wartime, increased Polish nationalist anxieties about the size of the Jewish population in Warsaw, which before the war stood at 38.1% of the total and would rise as high as 45% by January of 1917. This was largely due to male labor outmigration, which was far more pronounced among ethnic Poles than Jews. Once Poles began to return to Warsaw from the east in 1918 following the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and then from Germany in 1919, the Jewish proportion receded to 42% in January of 1919, and then substantially to 33.1% according to the 1921 census. Nonetheless, given the already existing pre-war anxieties about Jewish overpopulation, one can imagine how the sudden presence of tens of thousands of Jewish refugees in the city became a major bone of contention in Polish-Jewish relations, particularly during the first half of 1915 while Warsaw still remained under Russian rule, and into the first half of 1916 during the first full year of German occupation. Exact numbers are difficult to come by, but it would appear that the Jewish refugee population in the city reached 80 to 90,000 by mid-April of 1915. The Warsaw Citizens Committee, dominated as it was by Polish notables with only token Jewish representation, provided 1/6 to 1/7 of direct public assistance to the minority of Jewish refugees who received it at all, with the remainder coming from private donations and Jewish philanthropic institutions. Despite such negligible support, the Polish nationalist daily Gazeta Poranna Dwa Grosze, originally created to mobilize support for the 1912 boycott with its slogan "Swi do swego po swoje," claimed that Jewish refugees in the city Jewish refugees in Warsaw had become a burden on institutions entirely supported by the Christian population and were freeloading at the expense of Poles. By the spring of 1915, in the peak of the Jewish refugee crisis, the Polish press published increasingly dire reports of the enormous influx of Jews into Warsaw from the provinces, a situation which the nationalist Jochen found alarming, especially as it inflated the number of Jewish refugees to 200,000. When added to the pre-war figure of approximately 300,000, the purported presence of these additional hundreds of thousands would have meant the Jews constituted a majority of Warsaw's population. Regardless of their actual numbers, these Jews had to go whether they liked it or not, especially since they were making life difficult on the permanent residents of Warsaw and could easily provoke numerous epidemics. All these are quotations from Jochen. For more radical Polish nationalists, a danger to public health came not only from refugees, but more generally from the streets inhabited by the Jewish poor. Dzika, Franciszkańska, Nalewki, and Moranowska, they argued, had become the source of every possible type of epidemic. It is necessary in the general interest, Gazeta Prawna proclaimed, to resettle part of this impoverished crowd to other localities. The poorest categories of Jewish refugees were evacuated to the east in May and June of 1915. And as the city fell into German hands, the new general government declared as one of its first tasks a rapid reduction in the number of those who remained. And by November of 1915, homeless Jews receiving public assistance had been substantially reduced to some 7,000, and by the summer of 1916 to 4,000. Yet, according to Gazeta Prawna, in March 1916, the number of Jews in Warsaw had increased by 200 to 300,000. Against an overall decline of Warsaw's total population of 100,000, a fabricated demographic shift meant to sound off even greater alarms among the Christian population. The specter of Judeo-Polonia, however, was more than just a haunting demographic phantom. As the actual number of Jewish refugees in the city dramatically reduced under German occupation, fears of growing Jewish political strength in Warsaw came to the forefront. Under the Russians before the war, Warsaw lacked any form of municipal self-government. However, with the outbreak of the war, the Russian authorities approved the formation of a Warsaw Citizens Committee to organize the city's home front. As such, the committee, partially funded by the imperial state, began to assume quasi-governmental powers. Jewish representation on the original 15-member committee was confined to 3 members of the assimilated elite who were more Jewish by descent than religious identity, none of whom actually live among Jews, according as noted by Heint. The effective non-representation of Jews on the committee would eventually result in discrimination in access to public assistance and the institutions providing it, employment agencies and public kitchens, to cite but 2 examples, at a time of severe unemployment and growing food shortages. Reasons offered for limiting Jewish access included the notion that Jews, as owners of businesses, even if such a business amounted to little more than panhandling, were better able to weather the wartime economic crisis. More widespread, however, was the belief that Warsaw's Jews were amply supported by philanthropy from abroad, which then became an excuse to restrict public funding in support of local Jewish relief agencies. As the Warsaw Citizens Committee began to take on the functions of a municipal administration during and after the Russian evacuation, Jewish demands for greater access to public assistance and relief were translated into political demands for greater representation. Indeed, ever more open instances of discrimination, and in the case of the committee's Citizens Guard, outright persecution, made such representation an imperative of Jewish self-defense. Formed to preserve order in the city in the vacuum created by the Russian evacuation, the Citizens Guard was basically an urban militia consisting primarily of young male participants in Polish sporting organizations strongly influenced by the National Democrats. Jewish participation in the Citizens Guard was practically non-existent, and given such a profile, accusations against it of 35 separate incidents of persecution and discrimination during the second half of August 1915 alone should not come as a surprise. The subsequent transformation of the Citizens Guard into an unarmed regular police force to enforce traffic, sanitary, building, and industrial regulations did little to improve the situation. At the end of October 1916, there was not a single Jewish police commissar. In Warsaw's 7th precinct, where Jews comprised 2/3 of all property owners and 75% of the population, there were only 3 Jewish policemen. As late as the summer of 1917, Jews comprised only 5% of the city militia's force, which meant the Jewish policemen were invisible outside Jewish neighborhoods, and that the vast majority of policemen in Jewish residential areas were Poles, all of which created fertile ground for ethnic profiling in law enforcement. Thus, the stage was set for the contentious issue of Jewish representation in a new Warsaw City Council, once such a possibility materialized in the spring of 1916. The previous year had brought with it a Russian promise to establish urban self-governing institutions in the Polish kingdom, especially in Warsaw, but such promises remained unrealized by the time of the Russian evacuation of the city. However, when the Germans began to consider and then approve the transformation of the Warsaw Citizens Committee into an 80-member city representation in March 1916 and entrusted that process to the committee itself, the barely visible presence of Jews in that body became a matter of acute political concern. By that time, only 6 assimilated Jews or Poles of Jewish descent served on the 60-member committee, leading to calls in their moment for the expansion of Jewish membership to 20, which was more in line with the proportion of Warsaw's population. Such representation was not forthcoming, and Jews still had little voice in the drafting of an ordinance for the planned municipal elections. To organize these elections, the Warsaw Citizens Committee appointed a special commission, which met in several extraordinary sessions in April. Of these, the most contentious and divisive deliberations occurred on 16 April during consideration of a motion to reserve 80% of the seats in the new council for Christians. In arguing for a restricted quota for Jewish participation, Piotr Dziewiecki and Zdzisław Lubomirski, then the city vice president and president respectively, claimed that such a percentage was necessary to preserve the Polish character of the council. This effort to implement the doctrine of the Polish majority came to naught as the German authorities would ultimately impose their own Prussian-modeled ordinance dividing the electorate into 6 curiae based on property, educational, tax, residential, age, and gender qualifications, which severely restricted both the Jewish and Polish electorates. Nonetheless, in the pre-election political maneuvering that followed, the Jewish Election Committee, a Zionist-led coalition, negotiated a deal with a similarly broad cross-section of Polish parties to reserve for the Jewish bloc 15 of the total 75 seats from the first 5 electoral curia. Only the 15 mandates from the 6th curia of non-propertied male voters would be truly contested. Also contested, however, were the Zionists and their allies in the Jewish Election Committee by a newly formed Focus Party led by Noah Prelutsky, editor of Der Moment. The Focus condemned the political arrangement made in the interest of Polish-Jewish peace, which in the absence of a more proportional Jewish representation would fail to advance the cause of a secular and publicly funded Yiddish school system and other components of their national cultural agenda. The Focus challenge and mobilization of voters in the 6th curia resurrected Polish rightist rhetoric of a rising Judeo-Polonia in Warsaw, not dissimilar to that which followed the 1912 Duma elections. Writing on the eve of the municipal elections, Tygodnik Illustrowany columnist Bolesław Koskowski claimed that Jewish voters, as a relatively large proportion of the electorate, comprised, quote, an element completely different and separate from the autochthonous Polish population, end quote. To ensure that the new city council would have a distinguished and categorical Polish character, Koskowski argued that the polls on it have the unconditional majority, one dominated by the National Democrats and their allies. Thus, when the Focus actually won 4 seats in the 6th curia, Gazeta Prawna in particular worked itself into a frenzy, interpreting the voting results as a victory of extreme nationalism among Jews whose representatives were aggressively disposed towards Polish society. The majority of the Jewish council seats, 15 out of 20, however, would be won by the Zionist-led bloc, and even the Focus, whose aggressive nationalism consisted of demands for equal civil rights, an end to public discrimination, and Yiddish-based cultural autonomy, conceded that the future council would have a Polish character. The problem from the Endetsia's perspective was that the 40% plurality won by the nationalists did not guarantee that it would possess enough seats to dominate Warsaw's city council, especially if Warsaw's councilors, Jewish councilors, voted with the Polish parties of the center-left grouped in the Central Democratic Election Bloc, an independence camp associated with the increasingly popular figure of Józef Pilsudski and possessing 23 mandates. Not surprisingly, the Warsaw City Council, starting with its opening session of 24th July 1916, became one of the main arenas where Polish-Jewish political conflicts played out for the remainder of the war, especially as the Focus advanced and defended the cause of Jewish national cultural autonomy in an elected municipal body that acted as if it were a representative legislature in a still non-existing Polish state. The most heated exchanges occurred between Paludzki, noted for his volatile personality, but also for his early support for an independent Poland, and Dr. Konrad Zieliński, leader of the National Democratic delegation. For example, when at the Council session on 12 September 1916, Zieliński insinuated that the Focus were an anti-Polish party, Paludzki reminded his fellow delegates, "We have declared at the first session of the City Council that we are in solidarity with the Polish nation, but at the same time we demand full civil equality and national minority rights for the Jewish population. In terms of state allegiance, we saw this yesterday, we are Poles, but nationally and culturally we are Jews, and so we shall remain. Any kind of references to us as enemies is demagoguery." Paludzki returned to the issue of Jewish membership in the Polish civic nation on several occasions, particularly when he came under attack by Zieliński for protesting discriminatory hiring practices by the Warsaw City administration as, quote, "a violation of Jewish civil rights, not to mention their national rights, since I must emphasize that the majority of Jews are nurtured in a Jewish national spirit and are conscious of their obligations to the country. I will not allow myself to be lectured to in this regard." What particularly aggrieved Paludzki was his failure to convince more moderate Polish politicians on the city council who claimed that they opposed the Focus not because they were Jewish, but because they were anti-Polish. A frustrated Paludzki responded with a lecture about Polishness, Polskość, and its historic definition. Gentlemen, he warned, this statement is a bit reckless and dangerous for those who proclaim it, because if someone thinks that the defense of Jews by Jews of their own rights is something hostile to Polskość, then he has a very poor idea of what constitutes Polskość. For Paludzki, Polskość was about the civic nation in a modern multinational state and the equality of citizenship in it. He expounded his position in considerable detail in yet another lengthy retort to Zieliński, who had argued that the realization of Jewish demands for equal civil and political rights would result in the establishment of a hybrid state, a Judeo-Polonia. The major components of Paludzki's rejoinder bear repeating here. Gentlemen, we entirely admit that we have nothing in common with Polish culture, just like we have nothing in common with the religion professed by the Polish nation. Completely different is our relationship to the state. We always repeat it. We pronounce it in our platform during the elections to the city council, which we repeated at the first session of the council. In terms of the state, we consider ourselves Poles. We have participated in the building of this economic organism, which is the basis of contemporary Poland, and we have spilled our blood on this land. We are not demanding the creation of a Judeo-Polonia. We have said that we recognize the Jewish character of the country. We know the boundaries of our demands, and we are not demanding Judeo-Polonia. Such a Jew who will be permitted everything, who will be able to observe the rights of his own religion, who is able to speak and develop culturally in the spirit of the Yiddish language, this Jew will voluntarily and gladly fulfill his obligations to the Polish state. He will help in the building of the state. Only the state binds us together. For this state, we must work with common forces. Paludzki also cited evidence of Focus loyalty to Poland from his favorite cause, the establishment of Yiddish language public schools, for which he believed he had a mandate from the majority of Warsaw's Yiddish-speaking Jews. Quote, to correct any absurdities and rumors, I need to emphasize that in our program, Polish language and Polish history will be required subjects. Because as I have already said, more than once from this podium, we are completely conscious of our obligations to the country and the state. And any kind of statement to the contrary about us is either based on a misunderstanding or is a conscious lie. Nonetheless, Palutsky and the Focus would again be accused of disloyalty to Poland when they sought the intervention of German occupation authorities in Warsaw to prevent the discriminatory closing by Polish municipal authorities of Yiddish theaters, to which the culturally starved Germans themselves flooded. Palutsky was painfully forced to admit that, yes, this did take place. As if in anticipation of the Minority Rights Treaty that Poland would be forced to be signed by the victorious Allied powers after the Great War, Palutsky added, and I quote, "And you should be ashamed that between you and us, a third party had to intervene." This is the most painful aspect of Polish-Jewish relations, that we cannot find a common language, that we can't agree as neighbors living on the same land should, that you conduct a policy toward the Jews, that some third party must always come in to show that this is impermissible. Thus, the contours of future Polish-Jewish political relations in the early post-war period, already emerging before 1914, would become increasingly visible during the years of the Great War. Nor Palutsky's vision of and hope for a free and democratic Poland based on equal civil and political rights, as well as the rights of free national cultural development for its non-Polish minorities, swam against a much stronger tide. Few indeed accepted an argument for the reconciliation of cultural differences through their ongoing development and cultivation, not their elimination. Ilsky's constant rejoinder to focused arguments in support of Yiddish cultural development confined itself to two words which express an opinion widely shared by other Polish political actors, and those two words were "in Palestine." The specter of Judeo-Polonia coincided with the emergence of two modern nations on the Vistula and became animated by demographic and cultural fears on the one hand and political struggles on the other. The specter raised its ugly head in Warsaw during the Russian State Duma elections of 1912 and again as a consequence of the city council elections of 1916. In the post-war independent state, Judeo-Polonia emerged once more during the ill-fated 1922 presidential elections that ended in the assassination of Gabriel Narutowicz. Narutowicz, as we know, was denounced by the Polish right as as the candidate of the National Minorities Bloc, which had helped to secure his election in the Sejm. In each case, the invocation of the doctrine of the Polish majority, that is the national democratic plurality, accompanied elections which the National Democrats failed to win a majority. Judeo-Polonia would then eventually merge with and ultimately give way to another, even more pernicious phantom, which first emerged at the end of the war, that of Żydo-Komuna, and its ultimately murderous consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The first speaker on this panel is Professor Eugenia Prokop-Janiec. She's a professor at the Faculty of Anthropology and of Literature and Cultural Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Kraków. She's historian of literature, editor of the series Studia Polsko-Żydowskie, the Polish-Jewish Studies, and her main research interests include contemporary literature and literary criticism and the press, and in particular the Polish-Jewish literature and Polish-Jewish cultural context in the 19th and 20th century. She has published, among others, the międzywojenna literatura polska-żydowska jako zjawiska kulturowe i artystyczne, published also in English as Polish-Jewish literature in the interwar years, on literatura i nacjonalizm, twórczość krytyczna Zygmunta Wasilewskiego, and Pogranicze polsko-żydowskie, topography teksty, published in 2013. And currently she works on a collection of works by Stefan Pommer, a Polish-Jewish poet, and a series of studies on women's literature. And the topic of her presentation is Institutions of Jewish Culture on the Eve of Poland's Independence. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I highlight 1918 as an important year for Jewish culture from the perspective of a historian of culture, but it is also a kind of heuristic device. That is because until now various studies have identified a much broader period, including including that year, period 1917 till 1920 or 1916-1920, as a time of radical cultural transformation. Referring to the Polish context and Polish historical and cultural rhythms, it has also been emphasized that 1918 did not constitute a turning point in formation of modern Jewish culture comparable with 1905 or 1908. However, in making this synchronous cut, I expect to yield some cognitive benefits. First, I will enable us to examine whether and how the events of that Polish year found reflection in the cultural activity of the Jewish community. Second, I will make it possible to study. It will make it possible to study the ways in which some institutions of Jewish culture operated in unstable and complex external circumstances that prevailed in the Polish territories. It is obvious that the broadest historical context of transformations that were taking place at that time was the process of abandoning the old order of imperial states for the new order of the national state. In 1918, the German and Austrian authorities still operate provisionally in the Kingdom of Poland and in Galicia, while the Polish authorities are beginning to take over. And in the east, Ukrainian and Lithuanian governing bodies are also active. Thus, a new balance of powers start to develop between groups that until then had been minorities in the multinational empires, while both the German occupation government and the Austrian administration are making efforts to influence the emerging order. In all communities, in Polish Jewish community, it is a year of intensive political mobilization, and the questions of the future shape of the independent Polish state and Polish-Jewish relations are addressed in political programs. However, the new principles of the post-war political and cultural order still have not entered in the phase of final negotiations. We know that one of the most important factors was the deterioration of Polish-Jewish relations. This question was discussed yesterday, so I will not comment on it in detail. The situation of Jewish communities and the Polish-Jewish modus vivendi in 1918 differ considerably from one locality to another. On the one hand, they are influenced by the far-reaching consequences of ethnic policies pursued by the former partitioning powers, and on the other hand, by policies of the German and Austrian occupation forces. Third, institutions of the Polish state are already beginning to exert their influence at the central and local levels as well. It can therefore be said that in 1918 saw the overlapping of diverse orders established by the old and new political and administrative powers, of different legal systems, and of various patterns of intergroup Polish-Jewish relations. Studies of the history of local Jewish communities conducted in recent decades have already provided us with some tentative descriptions of Jewish social and cultural life in the early 19th century in various regions and centers, both in large cities, smaller centers, and provincial towns. Publications dealing mainly with the years 1918-1939 and less frequently with 1914, 1918, usually describe local cultural associations, groups, and organizations. Scholars agree that the years of the First World War saw a marked revival of social and cultural activities among local Jewish communities in the Kingdom of Poland and in the so-called seized territories annexed by Russia, as well as the formation of a new public sphere or public culture understood as a set of cultural institutions and practices. It is a definition coined by Jeffrey Weidlinger. The situation was different in Eastern Galicia, where successive spells of Russian occupation brought persecutions and pogroms of Jewish population, which triggered waves of migration to the West. For example, studies on the situation of Jews in Vilna and Lublin have demonstrated that the period of German and Austrian occupation of these cities saw a certain liberalization of policies towards the Jewish population. The situation in Vilna was described, it's the quotation, as a new era of civic freedom, civic liberties related to speech, the press, and the language. The situation in Warsaw during the war was described in a very similar way by Zvi Przywódzki, publisher of the daily The Moment. Local studies enable us to compile a list of various formal and informal institutions of public culture that were created during the war and operated in 1918. The local press, libraries, literary societies, dramatic societies, choirs, musical groupings. The picture of cultural life of that time would not be complete without supra-local institutions. Above all, the trilingual system of the Jewish press, which has already been developing before 1914, including journals in Hebrew, in Yiddish, and in Polish. In fact, scholars believe that press, I quote the opinion by Hone Szmeruk, was the most important element of the Jewish cultural policy system. It was also crucial as a means of sustenance for the Jewish intelligentsia and a basis of modern intellectual and literary life. There was also professional Jewish theater operating on a supra-local level. I would like to supplement this panoramic picture with a calendar of dates important to press, literary, artistic, and theatrical institutions established in 1918. I wish to point out that this is merely a kind of reconnaissance. On this preliminary list, there are Yiddish newspapers, Hebrew newspapers, Polish newspapers. There are activities of societies and associations like Jewish Committee of Arts, Association of Jewish Writers and Journalists, or as activity of Jewish theater. This basic calendar could be supplemented with dates concerning institutions that will later move to Poland and will temporarily operate in Poland. It is a broader context of developments in the Jewish culture in that year: Kulturlige, Hatkufa, Habima Theater. As can be seen, the institutions of culture established in 1918 in the Polish territories use three languages, Yiddish, Hebrew, and Polish. Their founders represent various cultural ideologies, different political options, and diverse projects of Jewish modernity. They include secular Yiddishist and Hebraist institutions, as well as institutions associated with Orthodox circles, whereas the institutions using the Polish language represent various ideological orientations, from Jewish nationalism to integrationalism. It is worth noting that the presence and activeness of modern artistic and literary groups and associations, which testify to the professionalization of the artistic and writing occupations and the development of a modern field of Jewish art and literature, to use Pierre Bourdieu's category. In actions and program declarations of institutions of culture, one can clearly discern their function defined by Jeffrey Weidlinger as the expression and representation of the group. It is especially emphasized by the press. The journals declare themselves as representatives of the local Jewish communities and important participants in the Jewish and multinational public sphere. Whereas the Yiddish press is addressed to the Jewish community and aims to serve primarily as a guide and source of information, the Polish Jewish press is distinguished by its awareness of functioning in a multinational public sphere. The Jewish national press, published in Polish, also accentuates the formation of a new type of Jewish public opinion and a new type of group representation, which are national and non-elitist in character. The program article of Nowy Dziennik, written by Oziasz Ton, puts emphasis on the building of new Polish-Jewish relations based on equal rights and equal duties, as well as a new model of intergroup communication, communication between two peoples, two nations, and not, as before, merely between two elites. Moreover, Nowy Dziennik, from its very first issues, adopts a characteristic geographic scope that merges Galicia with the Kingdom of Poland into one entity. This territorial outline of the emerging state creates a context for defining the position of Jews and as ethnic minority. The establishment of this newspaper will be presented as a response to the historical necessity of creating a Jewish platform for constant and direct contact with Polish opinion. It is known, however, that one of the impulses for its publication also came from anti-Jewish riots in Kraków in April 1918. The Jewish institutions created in 1918 function under conditions of unstable borders and uncertainty about the future territorial shape in Poland. The journals report on various concepts of the new political map of Central and Eastern Europe. Nowy Dziennik, for instance, publishes extensive commentaries on the concept of Mitteleuropa, as well as plans for dividing Eastern Galicia. In some cases, the institutions try to play the changing political and geographical circumstances to their own advantage. Thus, for example, Lubliner Tugblatt, launched in January 1918, initially built its position as a major supra-regional newspaper by filling the gap in the press market caused by difficulties in the distribution of the Yiddish press published in Warsaw. Nowy Dziennik, on the other side, is initially printed in Moravian Ostrava, from where it can be quickly delivered to Krakow thanks to the excellent Austro-Hungarian railway service. The editors adroitly exploit the situation in their skirmishes with local authorities and conflicts with the censorship office. The emerging institutions are dependent on local organs of power and have to adjust to the changing laws and regulatory systems. As they represent the interest of Jewish circles, the journal enter into alliances and conflicts with the changing organs of power. In 1918, Nowy Dziennik, for example, has political problems both with Austrian administration and Polish authorities, towards which it takes a critical stance. On the other hand, Jewish theater in Krakow operates beyond such entanglements, offering a more or less sophisticated repertoire without encountering any major administrative obstacles. We can see that in 1918, the dominant component of the Polish system of Jewish culture is undoubtedly the Yiddish language system. Therefore, the Yiddish institutions may sometimes take advantage of this position in their relations with the local administration. For example, Lubliner Tugblatt takes the role of publishing regulations and instructions from the local authorities, thus becoming a messenger between them and the local Yiddish-speaking Jewish community. On the other hand, Jewish culture in the Polish language is only starting to build its institutional foundation in a form of mass daily press. However, it quickly turns out that the opening up of the Polish language Jewish institutions to the Polish public and operating in a multinational public sphere not only offers opportunities for communication with the Polish side, but may also provoke sharp conflicts. In December 1911, Nowy Dziennik will become the target of an attempt to prevent its distribution as a result of accusations of anti-Polonism leveled at that newspaper. In conclusion, one might say that at least some of the institutions of Jewish culture established in 1918 were a direct or indirect reaction to the sense of witnessing a historic turning point. In most of them, except for the integrationist institution, there was a new awareness of the need to speak on one's own behalf and to build an autonomous modern Jewish culture. When we compare the list of cultural institutions launched in 1918 and launched in 1919, we can say that some institutions established in 1918 are harbingers of certain development trends, then come to the fore and crystallize in subsequent years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have asked Jochen Böhler for comments to these three papers. He's a senior research fellow at the Imre Kertész College in Jena, where he teaches courses on the history of modern Central and Eastern Europe. And in particular, he is an expert on organized violence in this region in the 20th century. His publications include the volume on war, pacification, and mass murder, 1939, the Einsatzgruppen in Poland, which he wrote together with Jürgen Matthaus and Klaus-Michael Malmen. Another volume on legacies of violence, Eastern Europe, First World War, written with Joachim von Puttkamer and Włodzimierz Borodziej. The monograph of the Waffen-SS, A European History, with Robert Gerwart. And his most recent book, published 3 weeks ago, the Polish and English?
Polish edition 3 weeks ago.
So Polish and English edition has just appeared.
Yesterday.
The Civil War in Central Europe, 1918-1921, which is kind of a new perspective on the tumultuous period which we are discussing at this conference. Jochen, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. And first of all, also thanks for the Polin Museum and the team and the board of this great conference for having me here. And I will be brief so that we have still some time to discuss the papers that have been given here in the audience. So, ladies and gentlemen, so let me start with a few general remarks on what we've heard so far. As a relative newcomer in Polish-Jewish relations in the dawn of the Polish, but definitely not Jewish Second Republic, I've been listening and making notes of November hopes for 1.5 days now. And I've come here with the obvious, totally naive expectation or hope, November hope, that at the end I would know everything about the attitude of Jews towards the independence of Poland in 1918, and I have finally given up to note it all down. As usual, once you dig yourself deeper into the layers of history, we all know that things get more and not less complicated. So, dealing with the topic, we are faced with a sheer endless number of actors, of varying motives, in a very special moment in time, when after the empires had vanished, everything seems to be possible, but on the other hand, at the same time, everybody seems to have a quite different idea of what should come next. So in this more or less complex situation, I am, as on a side or on a personal note, especially puzzled by the fact, maybe you don't have realized it, but I read the papers, so it's on the margins, that the Germans/Austrians in retrospective obviously looked like once in history like the good guys. So Konrad Zieliński tells us about the Jews in Western Poland, which were all but assimilated to German culture and preferred emigration to the future Reich instead of staying in the Second Republic. Although I knew that German rule in this, their first general government, was of course totally different from things to come from 1939 onwards, Robert Blobaum has surprised me with the fact that the Germans, for obviously quite selfish reasons, but nevertheless even acted as advocates for the Jews in the Polish-Jewish quarrel over the opening or closing of Jewish theaters in Warsaw. And Eugenia Prokop-Janiec, for her part, recalls the liberal Habsburg politics towards the Jewish press in harsh contrast to the measures implemented by the Russian army in Galicia in 1915. So we have heard yesterday from Natalia Alexiun of Galician Jews' phantom limb pains regarding after the separation from the Habsburg Empire. But in contrast, in this panel titled Realia, we are not talking only about rather diffuse nostalgic reminiscences after the facts, but about very real situational context. And I appreciate that today we are talking about these issues, not only from the German. This was just a side note, as I said, but it also gives an idea of the openness of the situation. That who would have expected that there was a perspective of longing for for German or Austrian future. So it is good to be reminded here that without the Germans and Austrians, the region would not have witnessed the devastations and the people living here, not the deprivations and demographic incisions we have heard about it of the Great War. And with Konrad Zieliński's demographic and economic survey of the Jewish population within the borders of the Second Republic to come, we get an idea what drastic changes it was confronted with in a minimum of time. Of course, this goes for the population as a whole, but Jews were often in the disadvantage when it came to cope with the dire consequences. The Great War often affected Polish Jews even harder than other inhabitants of Poland. This is caused first and foremost by their different treatment in the partition zones before the war, which led to different settlement and employment patterns, and also during and after the war. This was an ongoing. It was not resolved as you have just heard, immediately, and combined with all other kinds of discrimination, like unfair treatment, from unfair treatment and harassing up to what we heard already yesterday, also robbing and murder, that impedes Jewish mobility and thus adaptation to a quite difficult and complicated, as I said, situation. The only way to cope with this complex situation was for the Jews in Poland was negotiation with the Polish side as the future of actual government in Poland, and that's what the papers of Robert Blobaum and Eugenia Prokop-Janiec are dealing with. And it is striking for me to see how the negotiations got off with the wrong foot due to, as Robert puts it, demographic and cultural fears from the Polish side. Reading the quotes of Priludzki from the Folkist Party, stressing again and again like a mantra that his party's main aim are equal civic rights and cultural autonomy for Jews in a Polish state, project that they unanimously endorse, only is simply appalled to hear, one is simply appalled to hear the other side just bluntly repeat the image of Judeo-Polonia. Another form of negotiation beside the political debate in the Warsaw Council was cultural and intercultural communication, and that is what I would like to underline in Eugenia Prokop-Janiec's lecture. The emerging Jewish cultural institutions were not only an expression of the post-war Jewish self-confidence, showing the country and the world, here we are. They are a means to formulate goals and to negotiate them with the other side, as in the form of newspapers in Polish language. They were also a manifestation of the will to resist the Polish right-wing nationalist program of anti-Jewish exorcism. After the lecture of all 3 pages, I was asking myself about the link between the material circumstances on the one hand and the intellectual discourse that these papers mirror on the other. The 2 of these papers mirror on the other side. So I had the feeling like here also in this conference that there are 2 worlds colliding. What do I want to say with this? It is that we on the one hand we have a Jewish elite, and then on the other hand we have the rest of the Jewish population. They so men and women in the streets of independent Poland, and those politicians and journalists that claim to represent or to address them. So, and my question to Konrad Zieliński in this regard would be, if or / how the Jews in independent Poland, so the ordinary Jews, the average population, everybody, so the normal guys and women, arguably mostly occupied with adapting to an often whole new living situation, made use of these new cultural and political institutions. Did they, and if so, how? And these negotiation channels for their personal, practical, everyday purpose. In other words, did they use them to on a lower level to achieve more mundane goals than just addressing the overall fate of Jews in the independent Poland? So, how relevant were these negotiations for them? So, does a family struggling with a case of typhus or hunting for jobs read newspapers for what purpose, and follows political debates in the capital? You know? Or did they just use the new cultural institutions for the just for orientation and or distraction, which is also in an increasingly complex world? So, and I would ask the same, Eugenia. I would ask you the same, if I may, because you have been giving us a brilliant lecture on Jewish cultural institutions and newspapers, and I wanted to ask you if you can tell us and elaborate a little bit also about the readership. Who was reading these newspapers? Was it addressed to other only the intellectual elites, or did it try to really reach the masses? And another question, because I was thinking about these newspapers in Polish language, which who read them? Did Poles, I mean non-Jewish Poles, read them as well? And were they maybe even used as a platform for Poles that would sympathize with the Jewish cause, to publish articles and to formulate or to try to negotiate between the both sides of on the divide of Polish society? And the last question is for Robert. I'd like to know how the negotiations of the folkists. Can you say anything about how it was reflected in the community of the Jews in Warsaw? How did they follow this? That's what I have to say for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Would you like to answer the questions?
Yes. I prefer to speak in Polish. Let me... Odnosząc się do komentarza profesora Böhlera, zacznę powiedzmy od tego, że te strategie polityczne, negocjacje polsko-żydowskie, one miały skutki długofalowe, prawda? Ale na dzień dzisiejszy, znajdźmy się w listopadzie 18 roku.
Słuchawki muszę sprzęgać.
Okay. To jeszcze raz. Wszystkie strategie negocjacyjne, rozmowy i tak dalej, one oczywiście miały znaczenie, ale one będą mieć skutki długofalowe, trochę później. Znajdźmy się w listopadzie 18 roku i co zajmuje przeciętnego mieszkańca Sztetla czy warszawskich nalewek? Co on dostrzega? Dostrzega przede wszystkim zmianę, której się boi. Eugenia przywołała Lubliner Tugblatt, taka dość w dużym nakładzie wychodząca gazeta żydowska w Lublinie. Widzisz, mój kolega analizował jej zawartość treściową z jesieni 18 roku i o czym tam jest mowa? Tam nie ma mowy o będzie Polska, jaka będzie Polska, tylko najczęściej się pojawia zmiana, wielka zmiana, rewolucja, co ona nam przyniesie. Rewolucja nie w sensie bolszewickim. No i czym żyje przeciętny mieszkaniec Sztetla? No przede wszystkim znikają Austriacy i Niemcy, a więc znika gdzieś poczucie bezpieczeństwa, które jednak państwa, mówię o Królestwie Polskim, zapewniały, ale nie tylko, prawda? Kłopoty z aprowizacją, która i tak była fatalna, one się pogarszają. Kto tym zawiaduje? Do kogo się zwrócić? Coś tam nie dojechało, prawda? Instytucje gminne, które należy odbudować. Jednak mimo tych wszystkich zmian, które mają miejsce w czasie I wojny światowej, no większość mieszkańców ziem polskich to są Żydzi ortodoksyjni. Kwestie rodzinne, połączenia rodzin, poszukiwanie krewnych i to jest to, czym żyją przeciętni mieszkańcy. Oczywiście w Galicji tam zachodniej czy w Galicji wschodniej na to jeszcze się nakłada strach, taki fizyczny strach przed pogromami, a więc te negocjacje polityków żydowskich, one nie mają w danym momencie większego znaczenia. Oczywiście I wojna światowa przyniosła pewien rozwój kulturalny, więc masa gazet się ukazuje, sporo ludzi je czyta, ale to nie ma bezpośredniego przełożenia tu i teraz. Podobnie w czasie I wojny działania KFDO, czy Komitetu na rzecz Wschodu i tam plany syjonistów niemieckich i tak dalej, one nie znalazły popularności wśród polskich Żydów, ale nawet mało kto o nich słyszał. A tym, co było istotne, to fakt, że przyszli Niemcy czy Austriacy, jest bezpieczniej. Łatwiej jest uzyskać jakąś koncesję, bo te są rozdawane na bardziej, powiedzmy, uczciwych czy bardziej biznesowych zasadach. Ta jest ogromna dokuczliwość związana z eksploatacją kraju przez państwa centralne. Ona się daje we znaki przecież również ludności żydowskiej, ale to jest w jakiś sposób, powiedzmy, rekompensowane tą liberalną polityką, jeśli chodzi o kulturę, życie społeczne, dobroczynność. Co jeszcze? No, wybory samorządowe, o których chyba Michał wczoraj wspominał, mówiąc o Łodzi, to rzeczywiście było coś. Faktem jest, że w pierwszych wyborach w 2016 roku ta frekwencja żydowska nie była zbyt duża, ale mimo to około 1/3 mandatów Żydzi uzyskali, a więc no to jeżeli punktem odniesienia będą rządy carskie, rządy rosyjskie, to jest coś. No, uznano ich za godnych brania udziału w wyborach, mimo że ta ordynacja kurialna była tam, łatwo było manipulować i tak dalej, żeby zmniejszyć liczbę mandatów żydowskich, zresztą nie tylko żydowskich, bo i robotniczych, i tych wszystkich warstw, które no, kolokwialnie mówiąc są niższe, no ale te wybory były rzeczywiście jakąś szkołą no, nie wiem, życia obywatelskiego, czy edukacji obywatelskiej. I z tego punktu widzenia fakt, że wychodzą Niemcy, Austriacy, już nie mówię o zaborze pruskim, gdzie ta społeczność była zgermanizowana, no, więc tutaj nikt się nie zastanawiał nad tym, czy lepiej być w Polsce, czy w Niemczech. To było oczywiste. A więc wyjście okupantów wiąże się z naprawdę dużymi obawami na tym, co będzie zajmować przeciętnych mieszkańców ziem polskich w tym okresie. No te przyziemne sprawy bytu codziennego. Oczywiście no, młodzież żydowska i tak dalej, rozwój ruchów narodowych, one mają swoje znaczenie, ale nie aż tak wielkie w danym momencie. To skutki tej takiej no, intelektualnego fermentu i tak dalej, one będą widoczne trochę później. To no, chyba tyle na razie.
Robert?
Yes, I just want to address first the comment of Germans as good guys. This is, of course, only relative to the Second World War. I mean, really, we're talking about, you know, the ruthless exploitation of resources, attempts to introduce forced labor, which was aimed primarily at so-called Jewish shirkers, deliberate policies of economic deprivation to induce that labor. Anyway, I would consider the support for Yiddish theaters as an outlier. And even someone like Palutsky did not consider the Germans to be the good guys, but I'm not even sure he would consider them to be even slightly better guys than the Poles. But anyway, just that comment on the question about ordinary Jews. Of course, they were affected by persecution. They were affected by police brutality. Often this police brutality came in the form of enforcing so-called sanitary regulations. And Jews who happened to try to do business in so-called Polish districts would frequently be pulled from the street and basically taken to inspection stations where their beards and forelocks would be shaved. And then they would be told to go back to Nalewki. Anyway, they'd issue a number of different complaints to the city militia and to the chief of the city militia, Franciszek Radziwiłł, and those would go unanswered. So Palutsky, among other things, he was a bit of a Renaissance man, but among other things, he was a lawyer, and so he often collected written depositions because these complaints would go unanswered, and then he would take them to the city council and read them verbatim. So yes, because they were, I think, affected by discrimination and police persecution, they were interested in using the city council at least as a platform to have their complaints heard through Palutsky. As for, did Poles read Yiddish newspapers? Well, not necessarily, but but you know, der Moment had its Polish language counterpart that was developed during the war, Głos Żydowski. This was actually a focused publication. I think Das Jiddische Wort was also published as Słowo Żydowskie. So, you know, these didn't last very long, but there were these attempts to reach a Polish-speaking and Polish-reading audience, also with the knowledge that not all Jews had Yiddish as their native language. Anyway, that's all I have to say for now.
Thank you.
Jewish population in Galicia was linguistically Polonized. Ezra Mendelssohn, who was mentioned by Konrad in his lecture, considered this linguistic Polonization to be one of the most important features of Galician Jewish society, the separate society that constituted the society of Jews in Poland. We should bear in mind that system of education in Galicia was Polish. This system was established as early as 1867. So some generations of Jews in Galicia were educated in this system and acquired Polish as their even mother tongue, we can say. There are numerous evidences. I'm thinking about memoirs of some outstanding representatives of Krakow society that reported this acquisition of Polish language and Polish literature and Polish ideas via medium of Polish school in Galicia. So Jewish population in Krakow formed a considerable group of Polish speakers, of Polish readers, and it is not accidentally that first mass circulating Jewish dailies were established in Krakow and in Lwów, because in January 1919 Chwila was established in Lwów. I show it in this list of events, cultural events from 1919. As far as wider readership of Nowy Dziennik is concerned, I can say that we have evidences that this daily was read by Polish audience as well. Historians of Jewish press in Krakow, for example, Czesław Brzoza or Sabina Kwiecień or Janusz Wałowski, reconstructed the early debates between Nowy Dziennik and Polish local newspapers, which proved that Nowy Dziennik was read and was criticized and was accused of representing the Jewish position, the Jewish point of view. So the readership was both Jewish, I'm thinking about this Polonized strata of Jews in Krakow, and as well by the Polish audience.
Mm-hmm. And did the Poles also publish in Jewish newspapers?
I haven't found any evidences that Poles published in this year, but later on, yes, later on they published articles, interviews.
Can I say something that folks may find this odd, but Gazeta Poradna had a team of individuals who spoke and translated Yiddish. And so you can, if you read Gazeta Purana, you'll read excerpts from Heint and Der Moment. Of course, then they would just in order to polemicize with them, right, or to refute them. But it's clear that they were reading the Yiddish language press.
It's a peculiar form of the Polish-Jewish dialogue, whom you just mentioned. Right. We have some time for your questions and comments, please. I think Anthony was the first, please. Anthony, George.
I'd like to refer to this question of German-Austrian rule in Central Europe during the First World War, and this brings me back to Robert Blobaum's very valuable and interesting presentation, which of course reflects this very important book that he's written on Warsaw during the First World War. I wonder whether, when the polemicists were talking about Judeo-Polonia, they were thinking not only about the ethnic relations in Warsaw itself, but about German plans for the reorganization of Eastern Europe. From the spring of 1915, the Germans, and to a lesser extent the Austrians, although the Austrians played less and less a role, were the dominant factor in Eastern Europe, culminating in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in February, March of 1918. And this German reorganization of Eastern Europe, one can criticize it, but it was certainly a step forward to what had been there before under the three empires which had partitioned this part of the world. It did make some provision for national self-determination, but of a very limited type. But the problem for the Endek section of Polish society, Endek political leadership, was this was at odds with their whole political conception. Firstly, it involved the exclusion of Russia from Eastern Europe, and secondly, it did involve the creation of this is something that Piotr Wróbel talked about, some sort of multi-ethnic state between ethnic Germany and ethnic Russia. How seriously this was all taken, how seriously one should take the Komitee für den Osten is a big question, but the Germans had plans both in Ober-Ost and in the Generalgouvernement for the reorganization of Eastern Europe, and a lot of the polemics about Judeo-Polonia was that the Germans envisaged that in this new Eastern Europe, Jews would play a significant role. And German Jewish leaders, whether of the Orthodox or of the more integrationist variety, also wished to play some role in this organization. The contact between the Jews of the German-speaking lands, most of whom, incidentally, came originally from Prussian Poland. So the idea that these are quite separate from the Jews of Eastern Europe is not at all the case. They saw themselves as successful examples of what could be done in Eastern Europe, from Ludwig Lewandowski to Gretz himself, all of whom came from, and I could go on this point. But I think this is what the Endek press was thinking about, and particularly if you look at the historiography today, when they talk about Judeo-Polonia, what they describe is this rather, well, they exaggerate the extent to which the Germans would actually have introduced these matters and the extent to which the Germans would have actually conceded major political power to the Jews. On the question of the economic exactions from this area, which were certainly very painful in the forced labor, I'm not going to defend this, but this was the inevitable consequence of the Allied blockade. The two sides in the First World War did not differ in terms of politics. I said yesterday what I think about this. I won't repeat it. But I mean, the fact is that the Allied coalition, although they presented themselves as democracy facing Prussian autocracy, this was a fraud. The two sides were semi-autocratic in both cases. The British had a huge empire, so did the French. These were two sets of alliances which do not differ from themselves in what they stood for. And this is why, as I said yesterday, a German victory would not have been the great disaster which the Allied propaganda saw it as. I should say, incidentally, that a fair portion of my family were interned in South Africa because they were Austrian citizens during the First World War.
Thank you for the comment. Josh, could you please pass the microphone?
Thank you very much. I wanted to address this to Robert. You mentioned that in April 1915, 2015, there were 80,000 Jewish refugees in Warsaw. Can you discuss non-Jewish refugees in Warsaw at the time? Because there must have been not just a Jewish refugee crisis, but a general one. So if you can discuss that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Maybe we can collect a few questions. Kamil Kijek was the next one, please. Kamil, and then Jola.
I have a long direct question or comment to Professor Blobaum, because you drawn a fascinating picture how much the fear of Jewish overpopulation is invigorated by mass politics, democracy, and the question of national subjectivity in last decades and during the First World War. But the fascinating thing is that the fear of Jewish overpopulation is a stable element of Polish thought since the Enlightenment. If you look on Staszic, Niemcewicz, up from positivism up to the interwar Poland. So I wonder, on the level of history of ideas, or maybe even more interesting on the level of history of Begriffsgeschichte, if you could discern what was the new thing that was made by the modernity, the new meanings that were put into the overpopulation of the Jews, and whether there were some stable elements that go from the Enlightenment up to the interwar period.
Thank you. And the last question, Jola Żendul.
Yes, I would like to ask the question to Konrad Zieliński and to Eugenia Prokop-Janiec, but also somehow to comment yesterday a discussion, evening discussion about what does it mean Polish Jews, Polish Jew, or I don't know, Jews of Jew of Poles of Jew, yeah. And today we saw two different data, how many Jews were in Poland. In your presentation, in the first table, there was 7.8% of the population were Jews. And in Eugenia Prokop-Janiec citation from TON, it was 15%. And I think that this is not only the problem of the number. This is the problem of how we perceive who was Jewish in Poland. And I found in many books this number 7.8, because this is a number of Jews who in the census they said we are Jewish from nationality. And our historians, they prefer to show the data from the religious affiliation. Yeah, because when we saw at these two censuses, we will see that the number of Jews is increasing in Poland, but it was not the fact, yeah. So I would like to, because we use two different terms. And then we have this discussion about what we can say, yeah, Polish Jews, Jewish Poles, Christian Poles, and so on. I would like you to comment this, because I always gave this data from the religion affiliation, because we know that the census of 21 was a little bit, it's not probably the fair data we have, so we have there. So, would you comment this?
Could you please respond? Who may start?
No to odnośnie tej statystyki, ten pierwszy spis, no to tam było jeszcze bez Wilna i Śląska. Później to tam 10,1, prawda, ale no ten spis pierwszy, wiadomo, nie był najuczciwszy tutaj dla potrzeb referatu. Chodzi o jakiś taki ogólny ogląd tej społeczności. Oczywiście Żydów było więcej niż 7,8, prawda. Co jeszcze? Nie wiem, odniosę się może jeszcze tam do początku, co profesor Stola wspominał o tych, że były miejscowości tam, gdzie było nawet 100% ludności żydowskiej rzeczywiście, ale one nie miały statusu miast, a te uwzględniałem w tej swojej prezentacji.
Okay, I had quite a few. I see we don't have that much time, so I'll try to do this very quickly. The connection of Judeo-Polonia to Central Power plans to restructure East Central Europe. I think that we know that those plans were hardly static, and that they changed. It might be part of the Polish-Jewish, quote-unquote, conversation early on, when those plans for restructuring, as Piotr mentioned, did seem to promise a significant place for Jews in that so-called new order. But those plans changed, and what we see, I think, especially by 1916, is more empowerment of Christian populations, and in Poland, especially the Poles. This is why Poles are going to dominate those institutions of self-government that emerge, and not only dominate but practically monopolize them. In other words, the Germans cast their lot with the Poles in this case. I'm not going to defend the Entente as the good guys in this World War, in the Great War. There's certain amount of using the resources of the conquered territories in the East, as a response to the blockade, but I would say only within certain limits, and I won't go much further into that. We can talk about it over coffee. The general refugee crisis. Where's Josh? I think at the beginning there was a substantial number of Christian refugees as well, particularly from the western part of the Kingdom of Poland. But things change in 1915 when the Russian army basically carries out mass forced evacuations from almost all of the small towns surrounding Warsaw, and that's when the refugee crisis hit its peak. That's when there's 80 to 90,000 Jewish refugees in Warsaw, and the figure of maybe around 200, 300,000. That is perhaps the total number of refugees who maybe passed through Warsaw, but there's never more than maybe 80 to 90,000 there at one particular moment in time, and that moment in time was in April of 1915. As for the fear of Jewish overpopulation, going back to the Enlightenment, I think that someone else could speak more to that, but I would agree that it's something that is longstanding. But I would also add that it is something that was not just Polish. What was the new thing? I think the new thing was precisely the Jewish refugee crisis of 1914, 1915, and into 1916. I think that was the new thing in this fear of overpopulation and being, the so-called autochthonous Polish population being submerged by a Jewish one.
Yes. I just quote Ton's opinion. I'm not going to verify it. I consider this opinion to be Ton's argument, a polemical argument supporting his position, supporting his idea of building new Polish Jewish media. So I think it's his individual, private way of argumenting in favor of this task of building Polish Jewish press. As far as a census of 1921 is considered, I would like to point to the fact that Ludwik Krzywicki commented on the difficulties connected with the census, especially among the Jewish population. And one of these difficulties stressed by him was the problem with auto-definition of many townspeople, Stadt inhabitants, who are not ready to decide whether they were Austrian, Polish, Jewish. It was really the difficult situation for them to define on the secular level. So I think that among the shortcomings, many shortcomings of this census, the problem of formulating the questions during the census was also of vital importance.
Thank you. Any other questions? I see someone's hand. Yes, Stefan.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to add one short thing to the statistics question, because in 1932 there appeared an article by a Polish demographer on the minorities issues in the Polish censuses of 1921 and 1931, and he pointed out that in central Poland 700,000 Poles disappeared, and on the other hand about the same amount of Yiddish speakers entered into the census, and explains it from the fact that those people then declared Polish nationality, even though their mother tongue, which was asked in the second census instead of nationality, was Yiddish. So this, I mean, it doesn't change. I mean, it doesn't interfere so much with the presentation of Konrad Zieliński, but it shows how problematic this idea of one nationality is, and which the census forces for people to take.
To declare.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Any other questions? I may add a comment that this practical the inability of the past censuses to properly reflect the complex identities of the citizens has been somehow solved with the recent Polish censuses, when one can declare the first and the second identity, and which dramatically increased the number of people who declare themselves Jewish in Poland.
I think that the difference between the 21 census and the 31 census is clear. The 21 census asked people for nationality. The 31 census asked people for religion and language. The number of people who declared Yiddish as their mother tongue and declared their religion as Mosaic was significantly higher than the number of people who declared themselves to be Jewish by nationality, because obviously, although integration did not succeed in the Polish lands except in the Prussian territories where Jews became Germans of the Jewish faith, there was a minority who did become Polonized, and this minority is reflected in the difference between the 7.8% who declared themselves to be Jewish by nationality and the approximately 10 to 11% who declared themselves as Yiddish speakers. Not all the people who declared themselves Poles were Yiddish speakers, or declared themselves of the Mosaic faith. So you can get a clear indication there of the degree of integration, which is also, I mean, the censuses are not, they are flawed only in the sense that they ask different questions, but you can interpret these questions quite successfully. I have to say that the Główne Urząd Statystyczny was one of the better aspects of the Polish state in the interwar period, and their statistical handbooks, or for instance the material that they produced on the various Polish elections, are a model to other states. I mean, it's one of the great successes of interwar Poland. So these censuses were not that badly conducted. It's a question of, if you ask the wrong question, you get the wrong answer. Or perhaps you get if you ask the right question for the answer that you want, how many Ukrainians there were, and if you want to diminish the number of Ukrainians, you ask questions on religion, and you put pressure on people to say that they are a Catholic rather than Greek Catholic. I could give other examples here.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. As coffee breaks are an important part of any conference, it's now time for a coffee break. Before we thank the panelists, let me add an invitation. I see Tamara Sztyma sitting in the back of the room. Could you please show up? Tamara is the curator of our present temporary exhibition, and someone here mentioned that the education of the citizen of a new democratic Poland was a major challenge. This is exactly the topic of the exhibition downstairs, and Tamara, the curator, will be guiding you this afternoon at 3:30. So please do come. It's very interesting. It's also a historiography. It's a historiography by other means to a special target group, which is very young people, but quite accurate historiography, and then some eternal problems of democracy. And now let's thank again our panelists.